Christ is risen. Indeed, he is risen. Alleluia. Welcome to the Catholic Family News channel. My name is Matt Gaspers. I'm the managing editor of CFN, and we're just at the tail end of the Easter season, so I wanted to get in the traditional Easter greeting one more time before we come up on Pentecost, well, this coming Sunday. We're recording on May 15th, the year of our Lord 2024, and I'm very happy to be joined today by friend and colleague Stephen Mosher, who is the longtime president of an organization called the Population Research Institute. And he's also an internationally recognized authority on all things China. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, Stephen, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you again.
Thank you. We're going to be focusing primarily on the contents of his latest book called The Devil and Communist China, which was just recently published by Tan Books. And I'm very happy to say that Tan has graciously agreed to sponsor this video interview. So thank you to Tan Books for being our sponsor for today's video. And I want to read just a little bit of Tan's official description of Stephen's book to get us started today. So it says, in The Devil and Communist China, Stephen Mosher lays out in great detail the diabolical self-aggrandizement with deep roots in Chinese ancient political theory called legalism, which established the prototype for the totalitarian rule that the Chinese people suffer under today. It is perhaps no accident that the Red Dragon has been, since the founding of China as a unified country in 220 BC, as the archetypal symbol of that country. The devil's false promise has always been, you shall be as gods. And China's leaders down to the present day continue to make this Faustian bargain to the detriment of the Chinese people and ultimately their own souls. So I'm very excited to discuss this book today with Mr. Mosher, and I encourage everyone watching, after you watch the interview, visit Tan Books and purchase a copy of his book. I think we're going to put up on the screen, and I'll include a link in the description to the video, CFN's referral link. We have affiliated status with Tan Books, so if you use that link, you will also be supporting Catholic Family News, and we greatly appreciate your support. All right. Well, maybe Stephen, to get started today. Oh, I also wanted to mention, because we were just talking before we started recording, we just had the anniversary of the first apparition of Our Lady of Fatima, which is very relevant to what we're going to be discussing today, her warning against the spread of communism, of Russia's errors. So we certainly ask Our Lady of Fatima to be with us. I know you have a statue of Our Lady of Fatima in your office that we can't see on the camera, but she's with us. So we ask for her intercession as well. So before we get into the contents of your book, I was hoping you could share a little bit about your personal and professional background. And I also wanted to share just with our viewers, Mr. Mosher and I have gotten to know each other over the years, mostly through the Catholic Identity Conference we've attended, and Stephen has spoken several times. I think the first time was back in 2019, if I recall correctly. So it's kind of been an annual rendezvous, or we've met there several times. So good to be with you on camera today. I know you are known as being the first American social scientist to visit mainland China at the invitation of the Chinese government. And I think that was just a few years after the death of Mao Zedong, if I remember correctly. So I was curious to know, under what circumstances was that invitation extended, and what was really the purpose of that visit?
Well, first, let me say that I've been a devoted reader of Catholic Family News for many years, and I will continue to read it and recommend it to people because it's a great source of information about our common faith. So you do great work.
Thank you.
Um, for my part, in January of 1979, for the first time in 3 decades, the bamboo curtain lifted a little bit. It became possible to do research in communist China. Washington and Beijing had just signed a scholarly exchange agreement. China had agreed to allow 50 scholars into the country. Well, hundreds of people applied. So did I. I was one of the 50 chosen. I was the only social scientist, by the way. The rest were nuclear physicists and chemical engineers and other people like that in the technical and scientific fields. China was very eager to have them come to their country so they could pick their brains. China was not eager to have an inquisitive social scientist wandering around the country asking people how their lives had changed after 30 years of communism. So they turned my research down flat.
Mm.
And fortunately, the National Science Foundation had picked me to go, and the White House had been involved. And so Jimmy Carter, when he met with Deng Xiaoping, said, "You know, I don't know why you turned down the scholar from Stanford University, Stephen Mosher." And Deng Xiaoping, who was eager to get his hands on American dollars and American technology, said, "Oh, it won't be a problem." So I was allowed to go into China for a year, and I have to say, in retrospect, the Communist Party was right to be worried about what I would find, because many of the people I met in China privately, and I can read, write, and speak Chinese, told me that life had been better before the communists came. They
Mm.
said their lives had been turned upside down by the revolution. Their farms had been confiscated, their businesses destroyed. Many of them had personally lost family members to purges and persecutions and famine. And so the new China that I had been taught existed at Stanford University when I was there, the new China where everything was sweetness and light, where communism had greatly improved the livelihoods of the people, turned out to be a fabrication, turned out to be a lie.
Mm.
And of course, when I wrote about that, I got in all kinds of trouble, not just in China, but here in the United States as well. A lot of people were upset with me because they were afraid that I would sink their slow boat to China, that they wouldn't be allowed to go to China unless we all said nice things about the Chinese Communist Party and pretended that none of the deaths under communism had ever happened.
Right. And that brings to mind that so you visited in 1979, and wasn't it in 1971 that President Nixon went over there and with Kissinger, and that's kind of the beginning of this strange relationship that our country still has with a communist nation, kind of unique in history.
Well, it did. It began in the early 1970s with Kissinger's secret visit, where he flew over the Himalayas from India without telling anybody and met to set up Nixon's later visit. Nixon, had the idea of playing China against the Soviet Union, which we regarded as the preeminent threat to freedom and democracy around the world at the time.
Hmm.
Probably correctly so. And China and the Soviet Union in the late 1960s, early 70s, they were having clashes along the
Hmm.
Ussuri River in northern Manchuria. There were actually battalion-sized units fighting. So we were eager to enlist China in the struggle to contain the Soviet Union. And we were hoping that China would go our way. We thought that if we simply traded with China, if we sent trillions of dollars over in investment and built factories and improved the lives of the Chinese people, and that a rising middle class would demand respect for human rights from the Chinese Communist Party, the party itself might gradually transform itself and would peacefully evolve into something that was perhaps merely socialist or even at the beginnings of democracy.
Hmm.
That turned out not to be true. That the Chinese Communist Party was eager to get their hands on American technology and American dollars, eager to produce using slave labor, or at least serf-like labor, goods for export to America, destroying American jobs and closing down tens of thousands of American factories in the process. They were eager for the economic relationship which they could take advantage of and are still taking advantage of today. But they had no interest in political liberalization at all. In fact, they've
Hmm.
moved in the opposite direction. And the current leader, Xi Jinping, not to get ahead of ourselves, is is a uh, is a knockoff of Mao Zedong. He is a clone of Mao Zedong. He is emulating the first emperor of the Red Dynasty in all respects, including in his brutal crackdowns and COVID lockdowns on the Chinese people.
Right. Right. So as you say in your new book, The Devil in Communist China, and a good amount of it is focused on Mao Zedong. I did want to ask you to maybe give a little background on, and I read this in the book's official description, this notion of legalism, because I think you devote a full chapter to that, legalism and communism and the relationship between the two, and basically explaining how China really developed totalitarianism like over 2,000 years ago, centuries ago, something like that. And it seems to me that China was really primed in some ways or
Yeah.
predisposed for communism. Maybe you can explain that to our viewers a little bit.
Well, 2,500 years ago, China was engaged in a war of all against all on the
Mm,
North China Plain. The war went on for 500 years. You know, we had in the West, we had a 100 years war. That's a century. That's a long time. In
mm,
China, they had a 500 years war where
wow.
hundreds of feudal states warred against each other, beginning in 700 BC and continuing on until China was finally unified under the Qin dynasty, from which we get the word China, Qin,
Mm,
China. And the country, or rather the king who won that battle, was a follower of legalism. Legalism is kind of an early totalitarianism. It resembles communism in many, many ways. And
mhm,
under the legalist system of governance, you have state control of the economy. The state controlled the production of iron, weapons, and salt, essential ingredient for people to survive in their diet. It controlled what people read, what people thought. The books of competing ideologies, the books of Mencius and Confucius, were burned by the legalists, were burned by the first emperor of the Qin dynasty. He had song and dance troops going around the countryside singing his praises, very similar to the modern propaganda that permeates social media and the airwaves in China today. He had political commissars in the military to watch over the generals to make sure they didn't get too ambitious. Uh, the uh, the concentration camps of the legalist emperors the inmates of the concentration camps were the ones who built the great canals of China and the Great Wall of China, the only
mm,
human construction you can see from outer space. So all the things we associate with modern Marxist Leninism, the control over society, the standing army, the politicization of society, the lack of freedom of speech and freedom of association, freedom of assembly. We found in China every last one of those characteristics 2,500 years ago.
mm,
And the Chinese emperors, you know, we think of China as being Confucian, and Confucius said that people need to obey the emperor because the relationship is like that of a children to their father. And so Confucianism encouraged people to voluntarily submit to the emperor's rule. But if they
mm,
didn't, you see, underneath that was legalism, and the legalists believed in 9 punishments for one reward. The
mm,
legalists believed that if you spoke out against the emperor, not just you, but all your family for 3 generations would be killed. The legalists were very harsh and tyrannical, totalitarian, and so the emperors wore the silken costume of Confucianism, but underneath that was the iron scaffolding of legalism. And today in communist China, you have the Chinese Communist Party pretending that one day the government's going to fade away. One day everyone's going to be perfectly equal. One day everyone's going to produce according to their ability and consume according to their needs. That's just a fantasy in the same way that Confucianism was a fantasy. And behind that fantasy is the iron scaffolding of communism, where you'd
mm.
better obey, because if you don't, the midnight knock on the door is coming, and you're going to spend the rest of your life in a gulag somewhere.
Yes. And as we mentioned in the introduction, we got a you know just recently celebrated this week Our Lady of Fatima, and she gave us for modern times, the 20th century, and continuing into the 21st century, a very specific warning. I want to read. This is what Our Lady told the three child seers on July 13th, 1917. A portion of her message. She said, "If my requests are heeded, Russia will be converted and there will be peace." Of course, Russia was um, the main target or main actor in her message. But she said, if not, she will spread her errors throughout the world, causing wars
Mhm.
and persecutions of the church. And that's, of course, exactly what we saw happen in the 20th century. So I wanted to ask, when was it specifically that communism first started spreading into China from Soviet Russia? And how did Mao Zedong rise to power within the Chinese communist ranks?
Well, communism spread to China because Lenin in 1920 began sending agents and money to China to spread the revolution. He was trying to
Mm,
obviously launch a revolution not just in what became the Soviet Union, but in the entire world. And China was a prime target. So from the very beginning, the Chinese Communist Party was receiving instructions from Moscow. It was not only receiving instructions, it was receiving financial aid from Moscow. And
mm,
later during the Civil War, receiving arms and other supplies from Moscow. Um, China would not have become communist without the consistent, decades long support from the Soviet Union. So,
mm,
this is not a movement that grew up within China itself, as the history books written by the Chinese Communist Party claim. It was a movement that was imperialistic movement from the Soviet Union, you might call it, deliberately intended to spread communism. Chairman Mao um, is one of the most evil characters in human history, which
mm,
is why he rose to the top of this structure, this pyramidal structure of this hierarchical structure of communism. He was a brutal, relentless, heartless, um, factional fighter within the ranks of the Chinese Communist Party, as I lay out in the book, The Devil and Communist China. He was a man who, interestingly enough, when he was a small child, he was taken out of his village by his mother to a local stone monolith, a local
mm,
stone god that the villagers thought had supernatural powers, and he was rebaptized. He kind of had a second baptism there. His given name was Mao Zedong, but he was rebaptized by his mother to this the unholy spirit that occupied the rock supposedly as the third son of the monolith, the
mm,
Shirsanyadza. You could also translate it the third son of stone. And he was very proud of that moniker. He was very proud of that name. He often referred to himself in the third person as the third son of the monolith. Now, I don't know if that constitutes demonic possession, but it certainly opens up one to that kind of demonic influence, I think, to formally consecrated in that way, formally forced to kneel, to kowtow, and to pledge his allegiance to the spirit of the rock, we might
mm,
call it. And later on, he showed that he was heartless in so many ways. As a young man, he wrote, "There are other people and things in the world, but they're only there for my use and for my pleasure."
mm.
Think about that. As if he
Wow.
were some sort of demigod coming down from Mount Olympus, playing with other human beings, like moving them around like pieces on a chessboard and wantonly killing and using them, whatever was to his advantage, he would do. He was thoroughly heartless. The evidence shows he never really loved another human being. He abandoned one wife after another. He
Mm,
abandoned his own children during the Chinese Civil War. Most of them died. He took literally thousands of young girls to bed in his 60s and early 70s because he had read about a myth that the mythical Yellow Emperor had achieved immortality by sleeping with 1,000 virgins, and
mm,
so he had his secret police go and collect young girls, 12, 13, 14, from the villages and bring them to him every night. An evil man in all respects. Once he was done with them, he simply sent them back to the village, their chastity destroyed. He never forgot a slight. In fact, during the Cultural Revolution, which he launched because he was afraid he was being sidelined because of the disasters that he had caused in the 50s and 60s, one
mm,
purge after another, tens of millions of people dying in famine after the Great Leap Forward. He was afraid he was being sidelined, and so he mobilized the young, impressionable youth of China to read his little red book and to serve as his shock troops, sort of like Antifa and the Hamas terrorist
mm,
demonstrators on American college campuses today. These young people were deceived by Mao because what he was really doing was not trying to create a new China. He was trying to get rid of his political opponents within the party. But he had the Red Guards arrest the head of government, Liu Shaoqi. Liu Shaoqi was tortured to death. He had the Red Guards arrest the commanding general of the People's Liberation Army, General Peng Dehuai, who had actually saved Mao's life 20 years, 30 years before during the Chinese Civil War. That didn't matter. He had later spoken out against some of Mao's policies, and he signed his own death warrant. And Mao even had his closest companion, the man who had served by his side faithfully for 40 years, the premier, Zhou Enlai.
mm,
He had him killed, not directly, but Zhou had developed bladder cancer. And the doctors came to Mao and said, Premier Zhou has bladder cancer. Shall we treat it? You see, the doctors were under orders to report to Chairman Mao about the medical condition of all the senior members of the Chinese Communist Party because
mm,
he controlled their medical treatment. That's one way he had control over them.
mm.
And he told the doctors, don't tell Premier Zhou that he has bladder cancer and don't treat it. You see, he wanted to make sure that Zhou
Wow.
Enlai died before he did. And he did. Zhou Enlai died in agony from untreated cancer, which is spread throughout his body about a year before Mao Zedong died. But this is a man who had been faithfully by his side for 40 years, but at one point in the early 1930s had led the Communist Party and had been replaced by Mao. Mao never forgave him for that, and
Wow.
so had him killed. So this is, I could go on about Mao's crimes, but if Mao wasn't possessed by the devil, um, and I don't have any proof that he was, um, I don't think he would have done anything differently than he did if he was possessed.
Right. Right. And so you very appropriately entitled chapter 5 of your book, Lawless and Godless by His Own
Yeah.
Admission. That's a fascinating chapter. Um, and you also refer to him in your book as the killingest man in history, the title of
Yes.
chapter 7. And you state, if you wonder how 1 billion people fell under the control of Chairman Mao, the answer is simple: abject terror, end quote. And I always find it interesting that when it comes to 20th century mass murderers, most people seem to focus immediately on guys like Hitler and Stalin, but they don't even seem to consider Mao Zedong. So how does Mao compare to them in regard to total death tolls and just general devastation as a result of his reign of terror?
Oh, he's the killingest man in human history. He killed 5 or 10 times as many people as Hitler did, and several times as many people as uh, as Lenin or Stalin did together.
Hmm.
And the killing began during the Civil War because there were millions upon millions of civilian casualties during the Civil War because Mao would starve cities into submission, and
And just
the
to clarify, the Civil War, was that the period between the end of the last dynasty and before the People's Republic of China was established?
the Chinese Civil War ran from the late 1930s through 1949 when the
Okay.
communists took control of China and the
Okay.
nationalists retreated to the island of Taiwan.
Okay.
And even before that, Mao was engaged in killing his political enemies. In the beginning, he would do it personally,
Mhm.
um, execute people. Later on, of course, the magnitude of the execution became so great that he used his minions to do the killing.
Mhm.
But he was expert at killing with a borrowed knife, for example.
Mhm.
All of the surrendered nationalist troops in 1949, when it was clear that the communists had won the Civil War and the nationalist armies were surrendering, those were the troops he sent into Korea to fight against the United States because
Mhm.
he didn't trust them, and he let the U.S. forces, the UN forces, kill his potential political enemies. It's called killing with a borrowed knife. And
Mhm.
then after the success of the revolution, he began launching purge after purge, first to go where anyone related to the nationalist regime were taken out and executed. Landlords, people who owned a little more land and rented out some land to other people, were targeted and tortured, and many, many millions were killed. Rich
Mhm.
peasants, someone who had too much land to farm himself and had to hire labor during harvest or planting, oh, they were targeted too, and they were often tortured and killed.
Mhm.
Um, then the land reform, everyone got land for 2 years, and then they collectivized the land. So, he gave the land to the villagers with one hand, and then a few years later, he moved them all into giant people's communes of 50 or 70, 80,000 people. The commune I was living in China in 1979 and 80 had 80,000 people farming the land in
Mhm.
common under the control of Communist Party officials who, quite frankly, did not know what they were doing in terms of agriculture. They were
Mhm.
political types, they were political hacks, only interested in pleasing their superiors. The famine after the Great Leap Forward, 45 million people died in China. 45 million people. It's an unimaginable death toll from the famine. It could have been avoided. It's the biggest famine in human history, and it wasn't caused by weather or climate change. It
Mhm.
was caused, it was a man made famine. It was caused by Mao. In fact, I call it a Mao made famine. And it was totally avoidable, even after famine struck China. And the West began to realize that millions of Chinese were starving to death. And they were seeing the, the corpse-like people coming across the border to Hong Kong, wearing tattered clothes and obviously starving. Australia, the United States, Canada offered to send grain to China. And
Mm.
Chairman Mao, who was eating very well the entire time, he was always a little chubby, said, "Oh no, there's no famine in China. There's no famine in China. We don't need grain." In fact, he continued shipping grain to the Soviet Union during that time, ensuring that more millions of Chinese would starve to death. There are entire villages, Matt, in China that no longer exist because every living soul starved to death from 1960 to 1962. Starved to death by the killingest man in human history. Then we get to the millions of deaths and the Cultural Revolution. You see, the machine, the killing machine that Chairman Mao set up, feeds on death. It feeds on
Mm.
hatred. Communism is driven by hate, not by love, and
Right.
that machine needs to be targeting at all times of an enemy. And in the beginning, it was the capitalists or the landlords. Later on, it was the rightist, anyone who had an education. And later on, of course, in 1980, it became the unborn. And for 35, 36 years, the unborn were the enemies of the state. The
Mm.
unborn were provided the constant stream of victims that maintained the muscular tone of the system, that ensured that the Communist Party minions who were carrying out the orders of the Communist Party leaders would not lose their zeal, would not fail to obey the commands of their leaders to target, isolate, and kill this or that group. And so 400 million unborn children were labeled enemies of the state and fed into this modern day furnace of Baal to be sacrificed. So the communist system always has to have a targeted group for the people to be taught to hate,
Mm.
and also to see what happens to the targeted group so they will be taught to fear and be kept in terror so they will not resist the orders of the Chinese Communist Party. So that's
And the
all quite deliberate.
Yes, and that reminds me, I wanted to ask you about the one-child policy because if I recall correctly, that seeing that in action when you were over there in 1979 had a profound impact on you because at the time, I understand it, you were an atheist, a pro-choice atheist, I think is how you describe yourself at the time. And maybe you could share with our viewers the profound impact that that had, seeing the gruesome reality of the one-child policy in practice over there.
Well, I had forgotten the faith of my youth, of course. And I explained to people that I was studying for many years at one of the high temples of secular humanism in the
Hmm.
country, Stanford University, a place where the faith is rarely manifested and certainly not taught in the classroom. I'd never really thought about the abortion issue, which was a very convenient position for a young man to take. I considered it to be a woman's issue, and had not really thought about it. But being in the operating room when Red Army doctors were forcibly aborting women who were 7, 8, and 9 months pregnant changed my mind. And they were not just aborting these women 7, 8, 9 months pregnant. They were aborting them by cesarean section, if you can imagine that. They were starting by giving lethal injections into the womb to kill the unborn child, and then a day later they would open up the woman like a tin can and remove the
Oh,
now dead or dying baby, and then they would sterilize the woman to make sure that she didn't come back the next year or the year after that pregnant again. So it was forced abortion, it was forced sterilization. I saw women arrested in China for the crime of being pregnant. Some of these women were neighbors of mine in the village I was living in.
mhm.
I saw them locked up in commune camps and subjected to morning to night study sessions where they were told they had no choice, but for the good of the country, for the good of the commune, for their own good, for the good of the party, they had to have an abortion. You see, their unborn children had been declared to be enemies of the state, and the state
Mm.
always needed an enemy, you see. And so those were the women who were taken in at the end of the day for the lethal injections, for the forced abortions, and for the forced sterilizations. And I have to think that if every American um, had been with me in that operating room and had seen what an abortion actually is, and it's a killing of a tiny son of Adam, a tiny daughter of Eve, who've done nothing to deserve the death sentence. I think America would be absolutely pro life from conception to natural death. I think a lot of
Mm,
Americans simply haven't thought about what actually happens during an abortion. I, for my part, can't get it out of my mind.
right. Well, that was, I'm sure it was a horrific thing to witness, but at the same time, a saving grace from God. So we give thanks for that. And you turned out to be extremely pro-life yourself, as I understand. You and your wife ended up
Well,
having quite a few children.
I had no choice in the matter because the other thing that I had been taught at Stanford was that morals were relative and that ethics were situational and that, it
Mm,
might be all right under some circumstances to do this or that, euthanasia, for example. And there I was in the operating room witnessing a crime so horrendous, so evil, the taking of an innocent human life, that I realized, really, for the first time in many years, that actual evil did exist.
mm,
The secular humanists prefer to ignore that, right? They think of everything as simply being on a continuum of shades of gray, and they're
mm,
able to rationalize any crime. I couldn't rationalize this away. This was an absolute evil. It was as if literally the pit of hell had opened up before me,
mm,
and I recoiled in horror. And if you're confronted with absolute evil, you recognize that evil exists. There are only two possible reactions. One is to say, well, if such a great evil can exist, the universe must be mad, and I might as well eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow I die, because nothing ultimately is going to make any sense. Or you can say, if such a great evil can exist, there must be a compensating good. And
mm,
that's the direction I went in. And of course, I was led quickly to the source of all goodness, who is God Himself, and ultimately into the Catholic Church, which was the church that Christ, our Lord and Savior, established during His time on earth and continues to be with us at every Mass uh, in the Eucharist. So
yes.
it was witnessing that evil actually led me to the good and led me ultimately into the Catholic Church. And I've always thought that the little innocent unborn children whose deaths I witnessed in China had been praying for me. The communion of saints always made a great deal of sense to me, Matt,
Mm,
because I was working on their behalf in a weak human way, trying to cut funding to China's one child policy, trying to convict China of these crimes against humanity in the court of international opinion. And at the same time, I was working in a weak human way on their behalf. And I believe they were interceding for me in a very powerful supernatural way before the throne of God. And that's where
mm.
the grace for my conversion came from. And one day I'll have the chance to thank them.
Yes, that'll be a beautiful moment for sure. Since we're on the topic of the church and the faith, I just wanted to bring up, as I'm sure you're very familiar with, the church has always consistently condemned communism as intrinsically evil. One of the earliest condemnations actually came a couple years before the Communist Manifesto was even published. Pope
Yeah.
Pius IX censured communism by name in his encyclical Qui Pluribus in 1846. And then we also have probably the most famous condemnation is from Pope Pius XI in 1937 in his encyclical Divini Redemptoris. He labeled it even as a satanic scourge. That's a direct quote from the document.
Um,
And I think if I remember correctly, your book was actually released. Wasn't it on March 19th? I think it was the feast of Saint
yeah.
Joseph. So
Yeah.
that's very appropriate because in the encyclical Divini Redemptoris, Pius XI basically established Saint Joseph as a special patron against communism, and that document was issued on March 19th, his feast day, 1937. So the church has always consistently condemned communism as intrinsically evil for all of the reasons that we've been discussing thus far. So when communists rise to power, of course, they invariably target Catholics in particular for persecution.
Yes.
Not exclusively Catholics, but certainly in a particular and special way, might say. And you summarize in your book, chapter 14 is called "The Chinese Communist Party's War on Catholics and All Religions," beginning with Mao and continuing into the present. But it's interesting to note, unlike most other communist regimes, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP for short, has attempted. I mean, I think Mao, as you explain in your book, initially he tried to, the bloody persecution, trying to stamp
Hmm.
out the church that way, but then he
Hmm.
realized that wasn't working. So he
Right.
switched tactics and tried to subvert and suppress the church in China by means of something called the so-called Catholic
Catholic
Patriotic
Patriotic
Association,
Association. Hmm.
which you describe as rightly so, a front organization. And you also tie it to something that Mao called his second magic weapon, United Front tactics. So maybe you can explain to us a little bit about the origin and the nature of this Catholic Patriotic Association, which is basically a state-run church, and how it's alienated and abused faithful Chinese Catholics since its inception.
Well, first of all, I have to tell you, since you brought up Saint Joseph, that he was my uh, confirmation saint, my patron saint.
Oh,
So
wonderful.
I've always had a devotion to Saint Joseph,
Hmm.
and and I didn't know at the beginning that I knew very little about Catholicism at the beginning. I like to joke that I'm still about 1900 years behind in my reading,
Hmm.
but we all are, I guess. Um,
Yes.
so, so Saint Joseph has been there as a supernatural support for my work. I frequently ask for his intercession.
Yes.
Communism is a quasi religious cult. It has its own rites and rituals. It
Hmm.
has its own church, the Church of China, I call it. Um, it fosters a kind of xenophobia and ultranationalism to try to keep the people sitting quietly in the pews. The
Hmm.
acolytes in the church are the members of the Chinese Communist Party. The head of the church, of course, is none other than Xi Jinping, the current Red Emperor.
Hmm.
But it is basically a modern day expression of the ancient serpent's temptation to Adam and Eve. If you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall be as gods. Well,
Hmm.
communism basically um, tells an elaborate fantasy that if you simply follow its precepts, that that you can create heaven on earth. In other words, you shall be as gods. You shall create heaven on earth. The whole thing is a fantasy.
Hmm.
The Chinese Communist Party actually admits it's a fantasy. The
Hmm.
Communist Party, in a secret directive back in 2012, Directive Number 9, um, that was released only to the senior leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, but managed to leak out of China, says that an accurate accounting of the history and the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party is a mortal threat to its continued rule. Well,
Hmm.
why would an accurate accounting of the history and the ideology be a mortal threat to communist rule? Because they're both fabrications. I mean, the history is
Hmm.
is a fabrication. The ideology is a fantasy. You shall be as gods. You shall rule over heaven on earth. Um, so you can see that this quasi-religious cult does not want to allow any other religions within the borders of China. It wants to stamp them out entirely. And there is a war in China against all religions,
Hmm.
Buddhism, Taoism, Tibetan Buddhism, everybody. But Catholics are a particular target. Christians and Catholics are a particular target. Catholics, because the church's head is not in China, it is in the Vatican.
Hmm.
And the Catholic Church has said very clearly that it condemns communism, that there really is no possibility of true collaboration between communism and Catholicism. So, what is the agreement that the Vatican has negotiated with the Chinese Communist Party all about? Well,
Yes.
I heard in 20 18 that an agreement was being prepared that was going to be signed by both sides. And I went to Rome in June of 2018, and I was able to get a meeting with the Cardinal Secretary of State, Cardinal
Mhm.
Pietro Parolin. And I spent an hour with him explaining to him why it was such a very bad idea to sign any agreement with the Chinese Communist Party, because they would only use the agreement as a pretext to suppress the underground church. They would violate the terms of any agreement before the ink was dry on the paper. They were known for doing that. They'd violated every international agreement and every treaty they had ever signed. I mean, I could list the treaties for you, Matt. I mean,
Right.
clearly they're just they are not to be trusted. And I got all done with my presentation. And to his credit, he listened quietly. And then my heart sank when he answered me, because he said, "Well, the agreement's already negotiated. We're just waiting for the Chinese side to come and sign it." Well, now go forward 6 years. It's 6 years later. The so-called agreement has been extended twice. It's about to be, we understand, extended again.
Mhm.
The problem is there's no agreement. And what I mean by that, there's no agreement in the sense of a document that has been negotiated in good faith by both sides and signed by both sides, to which both sides have agreed to adhere. The Chinese side has never signed the agreement. How do we know that? We know that because last year, the Chinese Communist Party, on its own authority, whatever that is, it doesn't have the authority to do this, but it did it anyway. It appointed Bishop Shenbin to be the Bishop of Shanghai
Mhm.
without consulting the Vatican.
Right.
And after the appointment was announced, several months went by. The Vatican was very quiet. And then 3 months later, the Vatican belatedly announced that Pope Francis was recognizing Bishop Shenbin as the illicit Bishop of Shanghai, in order that the Catholics in Shanghai would not be left without a shepherd.
Mm.
And Cardinal Parolin was at a press conference trying to explain what had happened. And he was asked, he said, "Well, this is really a violation of the terms of the agreement." And he was asked by a reporter, "Can we see the agreement? What exactly are the terms of the agreement?" And Cardinal Parolin said this, remarkably. He said, "Well, the agreement is really just a working document. It's points that we've discussed, but it's still being
Mhm.
negotiated." In other words, what he said to me in June of 2018 is still true today in May of 2024. That they're still waiting for the Chinese side to sign this working document. The Vatican, for its part, has tried to abide by the terms of this agreement,
Mhm.
which the Chinese Communist Party, predictably, has violated again and again and again. So there
Right.
really is no agreement. I don't know
Right.
what else the Vatican the Vatican we need to do to convince the Vatican that it is futile to negotiate with the Chinese Communist Party. Um, the Pope, even before the agreement was supposedly came into force, recognized 8 bishops who had been illicitly ordained by the Chinese Communist Party to be valid bishops. So he made a huge concession.
Mhm.
The Vatican later abandoned their original position, was that we need to use the Vietnamese model to appoint bishops in China. What's the Vietnamese model? Well, the Vietnamese model says that the Vatican and the Vietnamese government, which is communist, will come up jointly with 3 candidates for an MTC, but that the final decision of which one of the 3 to actually appoint will be left to the Pope. That still
Mhm.
preserves the authority of the Pope. What the so-called agreement says with China says is that the Chinese Communist Party will propose candidates, and the Pope has a limited veto. That is, he can temporarily veto a candidate, but a senior Communist Party official has said openly that the Pope cannot continually veto candidates, because we won't allow that. We'll just appoint whoever we want
Mhm.
at the end of the day. And of course, even that limited agreement was violated last year with the appointment of Bishop Shenbin, because the Vatican wasn't consulted at all, they tell us.
Right. And supposedly, as the Vatican describes this as a quote unquote provisional agreement, how they announced it in September of 2018 on the appointment of bishops, supposedly for the purpose of filling these vacant dioceses throughout China. But if I understand correctly, isn't it the case that there are still many Chinese dioceses that remain without a bishop to this day, let alone
Yes,
having a good shepherd?
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
The number of sees that are vacant in China is around 40. And that
Mhm.
number really hasn't changed over the last 6 years. We're really getting about 1 or 2 appointments every year, which is not
Mhm.
enough to make up for the elderly bishops who are retiring or dying. The other thing that has happened with this pseudo agreement is that it is being used to coerce priests and bishops and laity into joining the schismatic Catholic Patriotic
Mhm.
Association. And how that works is the Communist Party official will bring in a bishop or a priest and will put a piece of paper in front of them that the priest or bishop is supposed to sign,
Right.
stating that they joined the Patriotic Catholic Association, to which which has their first loyalty.
Mhm.
And the they are told, the bishops and priests are told, that the Vatican has urged them to do that. So the Communist Party is using the borrowed authority, the borrowed illicit authority of the Vatican to try to coerce people into joining a schismatic organization, the Catholic Patriotic Association, which of course it controls. Now, the Vatican a couple of years ago did try to deal with this mess
Mhm.
by issuing an unsigned set of directions. We don't know which dicastery it came from. It's not signed, but it was issued to the church in China. And it says to priests and bishops and laity, if you're called in and asked to sign a statement saying you're joining the Catholic Patriotic Association, bring in witnesses with you who can witness the fact that you're signing under duress. Well, Matt, I needn't tell you how ridiculous this suggestion is in
Right.
a communist state where you're surrounded by a half a dozen communist officials who won't take no for an answer. You're not going to be allowed to have witnesses in.
Mhm.
You're not going to be allowed. The other suggestion was, well, if you're forced to sign and you're not allowed witnesses, just note on when you sign it that you're signing under duress. You're not going to be allowed to do that either. You either
Mhm.
sign the document or you're punished. You
Right.
can't write your own you can't annotate the document to change the meaning of the document. That simply wouldn't be allowed. So I'm viewing this entire engagement with China, which is so one-sided and which has harmed the church in China, um, and just shaking my head. We need to pray for our beleaguered Catholic brothers and sisters in China because they are under persecution. The Chinese Communist Party has taken control of the Catholic Patriotic Church away from the government Bureau of Religious Affairs, and it has put it directly under the United Front Department of the Chinese Communist Party. What does
Mhm.
that mean? What is the United Front Department of the Chinese Communist Party? Well, it's what Xi Jinping and Chairman Mao Zedong called the three magic weapons of the Chinese Communist Party.
Mhm.
They are propaganda, United Front, and the People's Liberation Army. Propaganda will control your mind. United Front will control your organization. And if that doesn't work, we'll send in the army and we'll deal with you with deadly force. So
Right.
the United Front Department is designed to infiltrate and control from the inside organizations like the Catholic Patriotic Association and make sure they serve the party. So
Mhm.
that's what's happened and happening right now in real time to the church in China.
Mhm. Terrible situation. I'm glad that we at least have very heroic voices like Cardinal Joseph Zen. We certainly need
Yeah.
God to raise up many more men like him in China to deliver the people and deliver the church from that tyranny. Um, I wanted to bring up, so you conclude your book, The Devil in Communist China, with a chapter entitled Mao's Enduring Specter, in which you focus primarily on Xi Jinping and kind of present day circumstances and the situation there. So Xi Jinping, as we've said, is China's current dictator, and you refer to him as Mao's true son. So can you describe in what ways has Xi's leadership resulted in a return to very hardcore Maoist doctrine and practice? Maybe give a few examples.
Well, people need to understand that the political structure of communism, where all power is concentrated in the top echelons,
Mm,
is a recipe for breeding the kind of moral monsters like Xi Jinping and Mao Zedong, because it concentrates all power at the top, and the factional infighting within the Chinese Communist Party is bloody and incessant. Xi Jinping rose to the top by imprisoning and sidelining a number of rivals, and he has done so by emulating Mao Zedong in all respects. Now, Mao
mm,
had his little red book that every of quotations that everyone was supposed to read. Xi Jinping has his Xi Jinping app on the phone, and you're
oh my.
supposed to, when you're in China, you download your Xi Jinping app on your phone, and you're supposed to read a selection from Xi Jinping's writings every day. And not only that,
Mm,
you have to answer questions on them. And whether or not you do that factors into your social credit score. In other words,
right.
how much credit do you have with the Chinese Communist Party depends on who you talk to, what you say, what you post on social media, and
Mm,
whether or not you download and faithfully read your Xi Jinping scripture reading for each and every day. So there's a personality cult. They're singing songs
mm,
in praise of Xi Jinping today in China. People have pictures of Xi Jinping in their offices in the same way they used to have pictures of Chairman Mao and other leaders on the
mm,
walls of their offices. There is a Xi Jinping medallion, that you hang in your car to
mm.
keep you safe while you're driving on the roads in China. It's
Wow.
all it's an effort to to deify Xi Jinping, to raise him, to elevate him above the status of an ordinary human being, which
Mm,
which of course all too obviously he is. So everything we associate with the cult of personality and the deification of Mao Zedong is being done by Xi Jinping, by Xi Jinping's supporters in the country.
mm,
And I have to say one more thing about Xi. Xi is a committed communist, and he is taking China once more down the socialist road to ruin.
mm,
We saw China's middle class created with the help that we and the West gave China, the technology transfer, the funding, the access to our markets, which has, of course, caused the loss of so many jobs and factories here. But this middle class, these wealth creators in China, the new class of billionaires, China has the second largest number of billionaires of any
mm,
country in the world, are now under assault. Why? Because Xi Jinping is behaving like the communist he is by expropriating the wealth of the wealth creators. He's put political commissars on their boards of directors. And once you've got a political commissar on your board, you're no longer in control of your own company. The
mm,
Communist Party is. And you can have your wealth taken away from you. The most dangerous place to be a CEO or a billionaire in the world today is China,
mm,
because you can be charged with corruption, you can be arrested, tortured, killed, suicided. Some of them simply happen to fall off the balcony of a 25th story balcony of a high rise apartment building, accidentally, of course. So there is a great confiscation of wealth going on in China today, and it will not end well. At the end of the day, because of the killing of 400 million unborn and the one child policy, because
mm,
of Xi Jinping's relentless effort to seize total control, to communize, as it were, China, because of his effort to destroy the very people who are responsible for creating the wealth that exists in China today. China is going once more down the socialist road to ruin and disaster and
mm.
famine. It's only a matter of time.
Yeah. I wanted to get your take before we start wrapping things up, and thank you again so much for coming on. It's been a really good discussion. I'm sure our viewers are enjoying it and really appreciating it. So I wanted to get your take on a geopolitical issue involving the relationship between China and Russia. I actually just saw reported, the Associated Press reported yesterday that Putin is actually going to be on his way this week to Beijing to visit Xi Jinping. Um, I wanted to bring up this joint statement that they signed in early 2022, about 3 weeks before Russia began what Putin calls the so-called special military operation in Ukraine.
Yeah.
As you'll recall, he visited China and signed a joint statement with Xi Jinping in which they, quote, call for the establishment of a new kind of relationship between world powers on the basis of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and mutually beneficial cooperation, end quote. And it also stipulates that, quote, friendship between the two states has no limits. There are no forbidden areas of cooperation. And this seemed to me a little bit reminiscent of the Sino Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance that Stalin and Mao signed back in 1950. So my
Hmm.
question is, in light of recent history and present circumstances, do you think that such friendship between Putin's Russia and Xi's China poses a threat to the world, to peace and stability? And then finally, which of these two nations do you think poses the greater threat geopolitically?
Well, I think obviously China does. China has a larger population, a much larger industrial base, and a much more robust and modern military
Mm,
than Russia does. Um, it has 8 times the population of Russia, for example.
mm,
Russia and China uh, were united in the 1950s by the alliance that you mentioned. We call it at the time the Sino-Soviet bloc, and we worried that if China and Russia continued to expand their influence, that they would control all of Eurasia and ultimately from Eurasia control the rest of the world.
mm,
Fortunately, the Sino Soviet bloc broke apart in the late 1960s, and there was actually conflict between the two countries.
mm,
Unfortunately, and I say we, referring to the current administration, by our blunders, have driven uh, Russia and China back together again.
mm,
Before Russia invaded Ukraine, um, Xi Jinping and Putin met, and they signed 6 different agreements
mm,
on the purchase, for example, of oil and natural gas from Russia to China, and other agreements. Those are the agreements we know about, and I believe that Putin asked for and received Xi Jinping's promise of support if he invaded Ukraine. And
mm,
that's exactly what he did. And we know that Russia has been supplying spare parts. I mean, China has been supplying spare parts to Russia,
mm,
including some munitions from the very beginning of the Ukrainian adventure. This alliance is continuing to solidify, and it is the second greatest geostrategic blunder that the United States has made in the last few decades. The first, of course, is enabling the rise of China into a
right.
country that wants to destroy us, led by the Chinese Communist Party. We did that to ourselves. And now the second is the recreation of the Sino Soviet bloc, this time with China as the dominant power, not
Mm,
Russia, creating once again a power capable of dominating Eurasia and wider parts of the world. Um, this shouldn't, the invasion of Ukraine would never have happened if we had had a president in office who was not compromised by
mm,
the Chinese Communist Party. Um,
yes.
you know,
Yep. Yeah, it's been very tragic, and it's going to be very interesting to see how the election plays out this coming November. It should be very interesting to say the least. I think my last question before we wrap up is kind of bringing things back to the spiritual plane. I think I know you would agree that the battle we face in regard to communist China is ultimately spiritual in nature, as we've mentioned throughout our discussion today. Um, and you mentioned something in your book that I found very interesting. Let me see. I think I have the page marked if I can find it here. Let's see. Okay. So yeah, this is in chapter 1. You say China had never been Christianized. The dragon had never been exorcised from China. On the contrary, he became the country's national symbol, the red dragon, which obviously in the last book of the Bible, the book of the Apocalypse, St. John the Apostle refers to another sign in heaven appearing, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. And he later identifies it as the ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan. So, what do you think it's going to take to drive that demon of communism out of China and truly Christianize that nation?
Well, first of all, Matt, we were given our marching orders 2,000 years ago in the Great Commission.
Mhm.
Um, you know, go ye therefore and baptize, all nations in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Mhm.
We have not succeeded in carrying out that mission. I think to the extent that our Heavenly Father was hoping we would. We were told, of course, as part of that mission, to create civilizations of life and love,
Mhm.
loving God and loving our neighbor as ourselves. Again, we have not been entirely successful in doing that at various times in various places. We've come closer than others, but we were never able to really reach China in any strong way. There were the
Seems
first
the faith
missionaries.
just didn't Yeah, the faith just didn't seem to take root there in the same way that it took root in other places, right?
Well, there were missionaries who got there during the Han Dynasty in the second century. We know that there were a few Christians in China,
Mhm.
and then all traces seem to be eliminated until the seventh, eighth century during the Tang Dynasty, when the Nestorian Christians got to China and
Mhm.
made some conversions, and then there was a persecution, and they were mostly disappeared. And then the early Jesuits and the Dominicans got to China, and the
Mhm.
first martyr, Dominican priest, was martyred in 1640. Before the coming of the communists to power in China, there were thousands upon thousands of Christian missionaries in China and a
Mhm.
couple thousand Catholic missionaries in China. And we were ordaining many, many Chinese priests
Mhm.
um, into the priesthood. So things were looking very, very well. Chiang Kai shek converted to Christianity, and it was a true conversion. I've looked at his diary, the diary is the notes that you write to yourself, and he
Mhm.
quotes scripture in his diary. And yet that effort failed with the coming to power of the communists, and the Red Dragon was once more in control. And, we're told to create a civilization of life and love. The devil only wants to destroy. And
Mhm.
his greatest instrument of destruction today on the planet, I believe, is the Chinese Communist Party, certainly in terms of the number of people killed and the ongoing persecution of Christians. There's simply no comparison. And China has spread its errors to other countries.
Mhm.
Russia having spread its errors to China, it spread its errors to North Korea, to Vietnam, to Cambodia, to Laos, and it's spreading its errors into Africa. It promotes corruption and death wherever it goes.
Mhm.
Um, how how will this end? Well, we know how it will end. We need to pray very hard. We need to understand that the battle we're fighting in the natural is only a pale reflection of the ferocious struggle underway in the supernatural. And we know
Yes.
that at the end of the day, that we win.
Yes. Yes, I'll just tie it back into the message of Our Lady of Fatima, the very consoling uh, closing of her message on July 13th. Um, in the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph, and there will eventually be a period of peace granted to the world. We need to do our part, certainly praying the Rosary, especially doing the 5 first Saturdays devotion and promoting the message of Our Lady of Fatima in every way that we can. It's been a pleasure talking with you today, Steve. Thank you so much for coming on the channel. And once again, I want to encourage everybody to please visit Tan Books online and order a copy of his latest book, The Devil and Communist China, where he goes into much greater detail into all of the topics we've been discussing today. Steve, hopefully we can do this again sometime.
I look forward to it. God
All
bless.
right. God bless you all, and may Our Lady keep you. Take care.